There is a specific moment most people have experienced but never had words for. You decided to change, not casually, not in the half-hearted way you've done it before. This time it felt different. This time something clicked. Maybe it was a doctor's appointment that scared you, a relationship that ended, a birthday that hit harder than expected, a moment you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person looking back. And you meant it. Every single word of it. You downloaded the app, you told people, you woke up early. You felt genuinely like a different person was inhabiting your body, someone focused, someone serious, someone who had finally figured it out. And then somewhere between day 4 and day 14, that person quietly left. Not dramatically, not with an announcement, they just stopped showing up. And you were back. Same habits, same patterns, same version of yourself you were trying to escape. Here's what nobody tells you about that moment. It wasn't a failure of willpower. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't proof that you're someone who can't change. It was proof that you were using the wrong model of change entirely. Motivation is a lie, not a small lie, a structural one, built into every self-help book, every productivity video, every motivational quote ever printed on a poster above a gym mirror. The entire industry of personal development is built on a single broken assumption that the reason people don't change is because they don't want it badly enough. So it sells you wanting. It sells you intensity. It sells you the feeling of being ready. But neuroscience has spent the last 3 decades quietly dismantling that assumption. And what it found underneath is something so different from what we've been told that once you understand it, you'll never look at your own behavior the same way again. Because permanent change has almost nothing to do with motivation. It has everything to do with something far deeper, far less visible, and far more specific to who you actually are at a neurological level. And understanding this isn't just interesting. It's the only thing that's ever actually worked for the people who manage to genuinely transform their lives. Let's start at the beginning. Or more accurately, let's start at the mechanism. The problem with motivation. Your brain has 2 operating systems running simultaneously at all times. The first is the one you think with, the prefrontal cortex. The part that makes decisions, sets goals, reads articles like this one, and announces to itself on a Tuesday night that things are going to be different starting tomorrow. The second is the one you live with, the limbic system, the basal ganglia, the deeply encoded neural pathways that have been running the actual machinery of your daily behavior for years, decades, possibly your entire life. Here is the thing about those 2 systems. They don't have equal power. Research from Duke University found that approximately 45% of everything you do on any given day isn't a decision at all, it's a habit. An automatic behavioral script running below conscious awareness, triggered by environmental cues, executed before the thinking brain even has time to weigh in. You don't decide to reach for your phone when you wake up. You don't decide to eat the way you eat or talk the way you talk or react the way you react under stress. Those aren't choices being made. They're programs being run. And motivation, no matter how intense, how genuine, how emotionally charged, operates entirely in the first system, the one that accounts for maybe 55% of your behavior on a good day. This is why every conversation about change that begins with "you just need to want it more" is functionally useless. You can want something with every conscious fiber of your being and still be completely controlled by behavioral programs your conscious mind didn't write and cannot directly edit. So what actually changes the second system? What reaches those deep encoded patterns and rewires them? The answer involves 3 things, and none of them are motivation. The first, mechanism, identity architecture. The most important discovery in behavioral psychology over the last 20 years isn't a technique, it's a sequence. Most people try to change behavior first and hope identity follows. They act like a healthy person and wait to feel like one. They act like a writer, a runner, a disciplined professional, and assume the self-concept will eventually catch up. But the brain doesn't work that way. Research from Stanford psychologist Claude Steele, and later expanded by dozens of behavioral scientists, found that the single most reliable predictor of long-term behavior change isn't goal setting, isn't accountability, isn't reward systems. It's self-concept alignment. Whether or not the new behavior is consistent with how the person fundamentally sees themselves. When what you're trying to do conflicts with who you believe you are, the brain treats that conflict as a threat. And it eliminates the threat the easiest way possible, by drifting back toward behavior that matches the existing identity. This is why someone who genuinely believes at a deep nonverbal level that they are not a disciplined person will unconsciously sabotage every system they try to install. Not because they want to fail, because consistency with self-concept is neurologically more powerful than conscious intention. The change that sticks doesn't start with behavior. It starts with a quiet, deliberate, evidence-based renegotiation of who you are. Not affirmations, not fake confidence. Evidence, small, specific, real moments where you behaved in a way slightly inconsistent with the old story, stacked deliberately over time until the new story has more data points than the old one. The person who changed didn't try harder. They began accumulating proof. If this is landing differently than the motivation content you've seen before, that's because it's a different category of information entirely. Subscribe right now because what comes next goes even deeper into the mechanism most people never hear about. The second mechanism, stress architecture and window of tolerance. Here is something that will reframe every failed attempt you've ever made. Change is neurologically stressful, not metaphorically. Literally, when you deviate from an established behavioral pattern, your nervous system registers it as instability. Your brain's threat detection system, the amygdala, responds to unfamiliar behavior the same way it responds to unfamiliar environments, with low-grade alarm. This is why change feels like discomfort even when the change is objectively good for you. Going to the gym, eating differently, establishing a sleep schedule. None of these things are painful in any rational sense, but they feel like resistance because they are registered as deviation from the established pattern, and deviation triggers the stress response. Dr. Dan Siegel at UCLA developed a concept called the window of tolerance, the neurological range within which a person can engage with challenge, discomfort, and novelty without the nervous system overriding conscious intention. When you're inside that window, change is possible. When you're outside it, the brainstem takes over, and the brainstem has one instruction for behavior under threat: return to what is known. This explains something that confuses almost everyone about their own failure patterns. Why change attempts collapse disproportionately during stressful periods, when work gets difficult, when relationships get complicated, when sleep degrades, when anything else in life demands more from your nervous system. It's not that you ran out of willpower, it's that external stress narrowed your window of tolerance until the behavioral deviation you were attempting pushed you outside it, and the brainstem executed its standing order. Permanent change requires two things simultaneously: building the new behavior and managing the nervous system's capacity to tolerate it. Most people do only the first, which is why most attempts fail at exactly the moments they need to succeed most. The people who actually change aren't more disciplined, they're more regulated. They understand, consciously or instinctively, that the nervous system is the gatekeeper of every behavioral pattern they're trying to edit. The third mechanism is environment and operating system. The last piece is the one with the most practical leverage and the least glamour. We talk about change as something that happens inside the person: a shift in mindset, a decision made, a new relationship with willpower. But behavioral science tells a different story. Research from Cornell University found that environmental design accounted for more behavioral variance than personal motivation in virtually every study that tested both. What is physically present in your space? What you see first? What requires effort versus what requires no effort? What's visible versus what's hidden? These structural factors shape behavior more reliably than any internal state. This isn't a soft observation. It's mechanistic. The brain is a prediction engine. It scans the environment for cues that signal which behavioral script to run, and it runs the script that best matches the environmental input. Change the environment and you change the cues. Change the cues and you interrupt the automatic script before it executes. And that interruption, that brief moment of choice that opens before the habitual response fires, is where actual change lives. The people who successfully restructured their lives didn't achieve greater willpower. They restructured their environment so that the new behavior was the path of least resistance and the old behavior required effort. They moved the friction, and the brain, always optimizing for efficiency, followed. The deeper truth. Here's what all three of these mechanisms have in common. None of them ask you to feel differently before you act. None of them require a specific emotional state. None of them depend on motivation arriving at the right moment and staying long enough. They work on the architecture beneath the feelings, on the structures that behavior actually runs through. And this is the fundamental difference between temporary change and permanent change. Temporary change lives in the motivational layer. It's real, It's genuine. It's just sitting in the wrong part of the brain to be durable. Permanent change is structural. It doesn't ask how you feel about going back to the thing. It makes going back the natural, easy, expected behavior of the person you've been quietly building evidence of becoming. The person you're trying to become isn't someone with more willpower. They're someone with different architecture, and architecture can be built deliberately, incrementally, without waiting for the feeling to arrive first. That is not a hopeful statement. That is a neurological one. You haven't failed at change because you're weak. You've been attempting structural renovation with motivational tools. That's not a character problem. That's a mismatch between the method and the mechanism. The version of you that actually changes isn't waiting for the right moment, the right feeling, the right level of readiness. That version is already being built. In the small, deliberate actions that don't feel significant, in the environmental shifts that seem too simple to matter, in the slow, unglamorous accumulation of evidence that a different story is becoming true. It starts not with wanting more, it starts with understanding what you're actually working with. The strange thing about change is that it rarely looks dramatic while it's happening. Most of the time, it feels invisible. The old habits are still there. The resistance is still there. The results haven't arrived yet. But beneath the surface, something is already different. The architecture is shifting. The patterns are being rewritten. And long before your life looks different from the outside, your brain has already begun building a new version of what feels normal. That's how real change happens. Not all at once, not through motivation, but through small structural shifts that eventually make the impossible feel automatic.